Human interaction between different communities occurs on many levels. While common beliefs and propaganda don't necessarily define every interaction, at its core lies a deeply personal sense of identity that often feeds on hostility. For reasons of security and dominance, individuals feel a strong need to define and belong to a group, the us. This naturally leads to distinguishing and opposing those outside the group, the them. This division isn't usually imposed from above in a conscious way. Instead, it emerges spontaneously and unconsciously within the human mind, often based on visible traits such as skin color, language, clothing, and cultural customs. The subconscious mind struggles to accept differences in others, seeing them as a threat. People feel an inherent need not only to love but also to hate, and the role of the state is to manage and direct both emotions. Long before the concept of the state existed, human communities had already begun crafting myths to rationalize the existence of both us and them. Over time, these foundational myths, all rooted in small subsistence-level agricultural societies, offered individuals a moral framework to process their feelings of affection and hostility. When a complex society eventually arises with a centralized political and economic core and a surrounding periphery, that core simply gives voice to the instincts already present in the wider population. It does not fundamentally change them. This natural tendency toward xenophobia is clearly illustrated in the case of ancient Egypt. Egyptians were highly aware of racial differences. They viewed their own skin as a reddish-brown tone, while they saw Asiatics as lighter and more yellow in color. People from the south were portrayed with darker complexions, deep brown or black, compared to both Egyptians and Asiatics. The word for Nubian, for instance, originally meant burned or bronzed, similar to how the Greeks referred to dark skin. Egyptians also recognized the distinct appearance of Sudanese peoples. Their language was notably different from Egyptian, which Egyptians considered the sacred language of the gods, cherished and longed for even when they traveled abroad. In contrast, foreign languages were seen as meaningless noise, especially the speech of Nubians, who were dismissed as unintelligible babblers. Clothing and appearance further emphasized these differences. Foreigners wore unusual items like shoulder knots, kilts, animal skins, or feathers. Some did not shave, and many carried bows or throwing sticks, all visual markers that separated them from us. The foreign way of life, so visibly different from that of the Egyptians, provoked a wide range of reactions, nearly all of them negative. These responses varied from mild curiosity, which was rare, to fear, disdain, disgust, and even a desire for total destruction. Foreigners were seen as people who didn't know how to live properly, described as hungry, wandering like wild animals. They were often portrayed as thieves and cattle raiders, lacking courage, prone to fear, and inherently untrustworthy. One Egyptian account claimed, "The Nubian only needs to hear a sound to flee. Speak to him, and he retreats. Confront him, and he turns and runs. But if you withdraw, he grows bolder. They are not worthy of respect, they are cowardly wretches. I, the king, have seen this with my own eyes, it is the truth." Even in times of peace, Nubians were viewed as lazy and irresponsible, yet feared for their supposed skills in black magic. Around 1425 BCE, the pharaoh Amenophis II warned his viceroy in the south, "Show no leniency to Nubia. Be cautious of its people and their magicians. Ensure that the peasants' labor dues are collected properly and delivered to the designated official. If there is no such official, report directly to His Majesty. Otherwise, you'll hear complaints like, 'An electrum axe with bronze fittings is missing, the sturdy staff has fallen into a waterhole, and another has been lost in the marsh.' Don't believe their words, and don't involve yourself in their affairs." The region of Kush, associated with Nubia, was typically described in degrading terms such as weak or vile. Nubians were considered doomed from the start. Whenever the Egyptian king led an expedition south of the First Cataract, it was often with a stated goal of defeating and subjugating vile Kush. In battle, Nubians were cast into a deeply derogatory narrative. They were called the god's abomination, deemed fit only to serve as tenants or subjects of Egypt. Their defeats were described in graphic and brutal language. One victory account boasted, "My Majesty slaughtered them in great numbers, both men and women. The valleys were filled with the flayed, and the mountains with the impaled." Another declared, "The Nubian collapses, strangled in the king's grasp. None survive. The Nubian cave dwellers are butchered across their lands, their guts spilling into the valleys, turning them red as if drenched in a storm of blood. Their corpses lay above, swarmed by birds feasting and carrying off the remains. This core attitude toward foreigners remained largely consistent across different regions. Whether dealing with Asiatics, Libyans, or Nubians, Egyptians expressed the same scorn and negative stereotypes, adjusted only slightly depending on the group. The Egyptian worldview was expansive and inclusive in the sense that it placed all peoples, foreign or native, under the rule of Pharaoh, who governed everything beneath the sun. Any action taken by foreigners for their own benefit, even within their own lands, was described by Egyptian sources as rebellion or uprising. Nubians, like other non-Egyptian groups, were classified as part of the St, a term that signified their essential difference. St referred to the arid hilly desert regions in sharp contrast to the fertile Nile Valley. These lands were barren and unproductive, seen as the domain of the desert god Seth, symbolic of sterility and hostility. Although often associated with the idea of chaos, this desert terrain was not considered disordered or random in a literal sense. Rather, it was seen as the opposite of life, hostile to human existence. In the Egyptian imagination, it belonged to a moral realm, not one of mythic or primordial confusion, but of deliberate and active malevolence. Those who came from such lands were thought to embody this hostile nature and thus had to be subdued. Their rightful place in the Egyptian view was beneath Pharaoh's feet, bound and humbled. However, this rigid worldview was somewhat softened in the context of direct, personal interaction. Inside Egypt or in Egyptian-controlled regions, Nubians displayed varying levels of assimilation, and generalizations are difficult across 3,000 years of history. During the Egyptian Empire, in Nubian areas under Egyptian control, it became fashionable for local chiefs to adopt Egyptian customs and behave as refined Egyptian gentlemen. In contrast, ordinary Nubian tribespeople were subjected to strict oversight by Egyptian administrators or intimidation by military forces. Nubians living within Egypt itself often resided in separate districts, although instances of intermarriage and cultural blending were not rare, and may have been quite common in certain periods. During the First Intermediate Period, Nubians lived alongside Egyptians in towns throughout Upper Egypt. Some even recorded their names in hieroglyphs and erected funerary stelae. Nubians who lived in Egyptian communities could access the legal system just like native Egyptians. There were also certain roles within Egyptian society commonly associated with Nubians. These included service in paramilitary police units, who had a reputation for harsh treatment of civilians, and lower-ranking court positions such as fan-bearers. Some also held minor religious roles, and during the 18th dynasty, a few were even appointed as tutors. Still, it is clear from historical records that discrimination against foreigners did exist. Even those born in Egypt to non-Egyptian parents were not always recognized as truly Egyptian. Mastery of the Egyptian language and culture was seen as essential to being considered part of Egyptian society. For example, during the reign of Pepi I around 2325 BCE, a decree forbade Nubians from harvesting crops on lands belonging to the pyramid towns of Snofru or from entering the temple. Nubians who worked within the state system might be subjected to mistreatment, including neglect, denial of benefits, or verbal abuse. One powerful document from the 27th year of Thutmose III's reign, circa 1477 BCE, suggests that foreigners living in Egypt could face legal discrimination, exclusion from palace grounds, and even physical punishment. A particularly striking tomb scene from Memphis, dating to around 1350 BCE, depicts a Nubian prisoner being beaten, a vivid portrayal of the harsh treatment foreigners could receive. In general, all foreigners, including Nubians, were barred from entering the sacred spaces of temples and excluded from participating in religious mysteries. Access to the divine was a privilege reserved for Egyptians alone. However, this attitude changed dramatically when Egyptians found themselves in foreign environments, specifically in autonomous Nubian communities. The earlier xenophobia seems noticeably absent in personal accounts from Egyptians who lived or worked in the independent kingdom of Kush during the 17th and 16th centuries BCE. These Egyptian adventurers, soldiers, officials, and craftsmen, often wrote about their time in Nubia in straightforward, neutral terms, free from a usual derogatory language. One man named Ka described himself as the loyal servant of the ruler of Kush, proudly noting how he washed his feet in the waters of Kush in the service of the ruler Nejken, and returned safely, enriched with goods. Another Sepedher recounted, "I was the brave commandant of Buhan. No other commandant achieved what I did. I built the temple of Horus, lord of Buhan, to the satisfaction of the ruler of Kush." Clearly, the lure of adventure and, more importantly, The promise of wealth outweighed any cultural prejudices these Egyptians may have held. For their part, the Nubian rulers needed capable warriors and skilled builders. In this context, Egyptian and Nubian interests aligned, and mutual benefit replaced hostility. As a result, inflammatory rhetoric lost its purpose and faded away. It would certainly be valuable to understand how the Nubians themselves perceived the racial attitudes expressed by Egypt, and whether they, in turn, held a similar xenophobic disdain toward Egyptians. Unfortunately, this perspective remains elusive. It's highly uncertain whether the Nubians and Kushites of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE ever developed a writing system of their own. Most likely, the majority of the population was illiterate and has left no written testimony to speak across the ages. We will likely never know what the young Nubian princesses, brought to the Egyptian court during the 18th dynasty, truly felt. Did they secretly resent Egypt and its people? Or, like the character Ida, did they quietly mourn their homeland with a tearful O patria mea? Among the few Nubians who did adopt the Egyptian language and culture, most presented themselves as loyal Egyptians, as true children of the Black Land and devoted subjects of Pharaoh. It's important not to underestimate the overwhelming allure of a dominant imperial culture. Whether Egyptian, Hellenistic, Roman, or British, the way of life of a victorious empire often exerted a powerful, even irresistible, appeal. Nubian leaders such as Hekenefer or Ruya were not simply imitating Egyptian ways out of convenience. They seemed to have genuinely internalized the belief that to be Egyptian was to become something greater. They saw Egypt as a model of civilization and power, a symbol of superiority. In a striking twist of history, when the kingdom of Kush re-emerged from obscurity in the 8th century BCE and began producing inscriptions in Egyptian, it expressed a profound disdain for Egypt, but one rooted in the belief that Kush, not Egypt, had become the true guardian of authentic Egyptian tradition. Egypt is naturally shielded by a series of distinct geographical boundaries, which deeply shaped the concept of borders in the minds of those who lived there. To the east and west, harsh deserts clearly mark the edge of habitable land with the sharpness and finality of a single dividing line. In the north, the dangerous Mediterranean Sea and the sloping shores of the delta act as a formidable barrier, effectively blocking passage like a physical wall. To the south, although the Nile provides one of the world's most accessible routes for travel, a series of 5 rapids, or cataracts, spread over nearly 1,000 miles makes movement in either direction extremely difficult. Within the floodplain and delta, the intricate network of waterways sharply separates parcels of land, which likely contributed to the later shift in meaning of the word T3S, from simply a plot to the broader sense of a district, defined by its borders. The Egyptian emphasis on boundaries is further reflected in how land ownership and disputes were handled, especially during times of economic trouble or internal conflict. One of the first actions taken after any period of civil unrest was to resurvey property across the country and update or reconstruct the official land registry. In more stable periods, various archives held detailed inventories of land, including farmlands, elevated plots, islands, and every kind of field, each clearly defined and often marked with boundary stele. These markers were sometimes labeled as royal decrees, officially validated by land surveyors. Tampering with or relocating these boundary stones was seen as a serious moral offense, condemned strongly in Egyptian wisdom texts. In some cases, landowners even invoked curses against anyone who might try to move them, underscoring the deep respect Egyptians held for clearly defined borders. For the Egyptians, the idea of a boundary carried with it the promise of security, rooted in permanence and stability. Without stability, there could be no peace. To remain in one place, fixed and unchanging, was to live in harmony, in accordance with Marat, the divine order. Within these boundaries, the settled agricultural community represented the very essence of civilization, believed to have been established by the gods themselves. Families working the land in the towns of their ancestors embodied the moral values favored by both the gods and the king. The notion of leaving their ancestral home rarely crossed their minds. As one saying encouraged, be strong-hearted. Embrace your children, kiss your wife, and tend to your home, there is nothing better.
Prosper where you arend biburieder.
Outside the boundary, however, lay a realm of danger and disorder. There the nomadic Bedouin lived a harsh, rootless life, always moving, constantly fighting, unable to settle. The boundary represented a clear divide between the God-ordained, stable Egyptian society and the chaotic, lawless wanderers of the wilderness. This line had to be guarded. Fortifications were built, and garrisons established to prevent unauthorized entry. The idea of nomads settling in Egypt's cultivated regions was unacceptable, and efforts were made to stop them. Outposts along the frontier monitored seasonal migrations and blocked attempts to settle. On specific days, some were permitted to pass for trading purposes, but only temporarily. Once their business was done, they had to leave. An inscription from the southern frontier in the late Middle Kingdom, around the mid-19th century BCE, formally recorded these regulations. Boundary established in year 8 under the majesty of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt Kakhauri, given life forever. To prohibit any Nubian from crossing by water or land in a K3I boat, or bringing any livestock across, except for those Nubians who come to trade in Akin or on official missions. These individuals are to be treated well in every respect, but no Nubian K3I boat is ever to pass by He going north. Maintaining the border required determination, consistency, and constant vigilance. It was not a duty for the faint-hearted. King Senwosret III made this clear when he gave a stern warning to future generations. Any son of mine who strengthens this boundary which my majesty has created is truly my son. He was born to me. How excellent is the son who defends his father and fortifies the borders of his lineage. But whoever allows it to be lost, who fails to fight for it, he is not my son, and he was never born to me. While the boundary was primarily designed to control the movement of people from the outside into Egypt's interior, it also served to regulate the flow of goods entering the country. More specifically, it ensured that only the finest or most valuable items were allowed through and that they were directed to their intended destinations. A title such as Overseer of the Restricted Entry Points of Upper Egypt suggests a role dedicated to monitoring what entered Egypt, either through the Nile cataracts or along desert routes leading from the west into Upper Egypt. Many of the imported goods were considered sensitive or confidential, and local officials took great pride in being entrusted with such matters by the royal administration. One common expression of prestige among these officials was the repeated claim, "I was privy to all confidential goods brought through the restricted entry point from the southern foreign lands." Egypt's natural geography granted it well-protected and clearly defined frontiers. The deserts flanking the Nile to the east and west were nearly impossible to cross. Only 3 passes through the eastern desert offered possible transit routes, but all were closely monitored and controlled by the Egyptians. The Wadi Araba, situated north across from the Fayum, provided access to the Red Sea coast and the Sinai beyond. The Wadi Hammamat led to diorite quarries and offered the shortest path to the Red Sea and the land of Punt. Meanwhile, the Wadi Mia served as a gateway to Egypt's gold mines. When nomadic groups from the desert did occasionally reach the Nile Valley, they came only in small numbers that posed little threat. The western desert, though dotted with oases and crossed by a major north-south route, offered very limited access to the Nile. The few potential entry points, through the Fayum, Asiut, or Abydos, were never attractive to large hostile groups seeking to raid or invade. Foreigners most often entered Egypt through 3 main points, along the flanks of the delta and at Elephantine near the First Cataract. While the Mediterranean coastline boasted up to 9 Nile mouths, which may have seemed promising to unaware Asiatic or Greek sailors, in reality, each of these outlets was notoriously difficult to navigate with the sailing technology of the Bronze and Iron Ages. The Egyptians took advantage of this by stationing garrisons at these river mouths and erecting strategically positioned watchtowers, making any seaborne invasion of Lower Egypt nearly impossible. Land-based access from the north was equally restricted. Routes along the North African coast were hemmed in by the vast Sahara and Sinai deserts, narrowing into just a few access points into the delta. In most situations, 1 or 2 well-placed forts were all that was needed to block entry and hold off any unwanted group indefinitely. Although physical remains of such forts from the Old and Middle Kingdoms have yet to be found, records of military titles from those periods clearly confirm their existence. Judging by the forts found in Nubia during the Middle Kingdom and based on depictions in tomb paintings and reliefs, these defensive structures were likely formidable, built with thick mud brick walls, towers, battlements, sloped defenses, and sometimes even moats. During times of political instability or reduced military presence, when commanders and garrisons were withdrawn, the border became more vulnerable. Even then, only small groups of nomads occasionally crossed, usually just to water their flocks. Although the 12th dynasty succeeded in extending Egypt's political border as far south as Semna, near the Second Cataract, a boundary that still influences the modern state's southern limit, true Egypt effectively ended at the First Cataract. It was here, in the communities of Aswan and Elephantine, that the Egyptian language and culture reached their southernmost expression. Small in number and geographically isolated within what was essentially a Nile-bound oasis, The people of this region lived a rustic life. Their local dialect was so distinct that it was nearly unintelligible to Egyptians from the north, and tradition even claimed that the constant roar of the cataract had left them partially deaf. Like many settlements in what was known as the head of the south, these towns lacked the wealth or influence to attract top artisans. As a result, their tombs and shrines were typically modest in both design and craftsmanship. Only when the king intervened, providing skilled labor and materials, did structures of truly fine quality emerge. Elephantine's remoteness and limited resources also meant that its local officials held lesser status compared to their northern counterparts. Most of them served as ata, royal appointees who managed estates at the king's discretion. Few rose to the prestigious title of Great Chief of the Township, a rank attained by governors in more prominent cities farther north, such as in the 2nd, 4th, or 6th provinces of Upper Egypt. These local leaders often served the state directly, supervising granite quarrying or leading trade expeditions into Nubia. On occasion, when the king passed through on a southern campaign or journey, he might honor the town with a royal meal sent to the governor or even grant the rare gift of northern servants and a tomb built at state expense, an honor worth boasting about. A governor invited to the royal jubilee might erupt in extravagant praise for the king, delighting in the favor shown to such a distant region. Governor Sarenput, a bold figure fond of women and confident in his position, proudly declared that he owed no bow or gesture of submission to any official above him, his authority having been confirmed by the king himself. During times when the central government turned its attention to southern affairs, Elephantine might find itself the focus of royal favor. Yet its isolation also offered advantages. Distant from the capital, ambitious governors sometimes took liberties, engaging in questionable behavior with little fear of being summoned before the broad hall of Horus, Egypt's court of justice. Life on the rocky island was far from easy. The small amount of fertile land limited local food production, so the community relied heavily on supplies brought from the north and on fishing for sustenance. But fishing wasn't just a peaceful pastime. Fishermen also carried the responsibility of keeping the cataract's navigable channel clear and properly dredged. No doubt, the local people looked forward to the arrival of expeditions heading south into Nubia or to the nearby granite quarries. Such visits created a temporary demand for goods and services, providing much-needed income. A similar sense of anticipation likely surrounded the return of military forces from Nubian campaigns, when high-ranking officials gathered at the cataract to welcome the triumphant pharaoh home. Throughout its long history, Egypt's orientation was consistently directed upriver. On any map drawn in pharaonic times that included northeastern Africa, the south would be shown at the top. The word for west, imt, was derived from the Afroasiatic root for right hand, and the verb used for moving forward by ship actually meant to sail south. In each Egyptian town, the front was located on its southern side, and the phrase the forward part of the earth referred to the southernmost region of Nubia. This area, therefore, occupied a central place in Egypt's awareness, and especially during the Old Kingdom, was the primary focus of its external ambitions. The outward military expansion initiated by the early kings of the First Dynasty, styled as warlike manifestations of Horus, did not seem to continue during the Second Dynasty. For reasons that remain unclear, Egypt appears to have ceased its attempts to establish authority over non-Egyptian-speaking populations in both Sudan and Asia. The one notable exception was the arid stretch of the Nile between Silsileh and Aswan, a region traditionally known as the Land of the Bow, or Nubia. However, during the early 3rd millennium BCE, this area may have been only sparsely populated, and in any case, the natural barrier of the First Cataract offered a more secure and practical frontier than Silsileh. From that point on, Egypt's objectives were limited to extracting resources from the region south of the cataract. Its strategy shifted accordingly to prioritize access and control. Although the king's cartouches might loom symbolically over the cataract and fortified outposts stood watch at the frontier, a more effective method of asserting power was through armed expeditions, pharaonic march-arounds, or mobile campaigns. These operations not only yielded plunder but also opened up opportunities for trade and the acquisition of slaves, especially when local populations were sufficiently intimidated. Such expeditions often paid for themselves through the goods and captives they returned with. Records that have survived hint at the grand scale of these operations. In one campaign from the 13th or 14th year of King Snefru's reign, it is said that he ravaged the land of the Nubians, capturing 7,000 people and seizing 200,000 head of cattle. Additional graffiti carved on the rocks of Lower Nubia shortly after Snefru's reign describe events such as the arrival of the royal agent for the 17th Upper Egyptian province, Kabaubat, with an army of 20,000, and the devastation of Wawat, and the royal agent for the northern district of the east, Zawibi, capturing 17,000 Nubians. The immediate consequence of these mass raids was the depopulation of Lower Nubia, which is corroborated by archaeological findings. While visual depictions of such captives are rarer, they do appear in art, usually shown serving in Egyptian households and labeled simply as Niziu Nubians, 3 foreigners, or kilt wearers. This last term, previously misinterpreted in older scholarship as interpreters, actually refers to paramilitary groups, possibly used as auxiliary troops or internal security forces, much like the Medjay in the New Kingdom. Nubians were widely respected for their skill in combat, a reputation that endured long after the circumstances that created it had faded. As early as the Old Kingdom, their value as fighters is evident in records of Egyptian military recruitment. When Wayne, the governor of Upper Egypt, was assigned by King Pepi I around 2350 BCE to lead a punitive campaign against the people of Palestine, he assembled forces not only from Upper and Lower Egypt, but also included Nubian soldiers from Urtjet, Medja, Yam, Wawat, and Ka. Even during the First Intermediate Period, when Egypt's control over Nubia significantly declined, Nubians continued to seek service in the Egyptian military. Local governors of Upper Egypt, known as nomarchs, were more than willing to welcome Nubians into their smaller, locally organized militias. Since prehistoric times, the people living along the Nile Valley and in the delta north of the First Cataract had known that many highly valued tropical goods did not originate in Egypt, but came from the lands of the Sudan, or even farther south. For the pre-dynastic period, only occasional archaeological finds offer limited evidence of what southern goods Nilotic communities were able to acquire. However, with the advent of writing, a more detailed picture emerges. It becomes clear that large-scale acquisition of African goods could only be carried out by individuals with access to transportation, manpower, and logistical support. Typically, this meant the king himself. Whether obtained through trade or coercion, these southern products were sent to Memphis and stored in the royal treasury, classified as royal luxury goods. It is not always evident that the goods Egyptians so desired were produced in Nubia itself. In many cases, they were simply passing through, intercepted or exchanged by Egyptians as they traveled northward from deeper regions in Africa. Most of these items were tropical in nature and unavailable anywhere north of the First Cataract. Among the most common imports, from the Old Kingdom through to classical times, were ivory, both raw tusks and crafted pieces, and ebony. In the more detailed records of the New Kingdom, both are shown to have originated in the more distant land of Kush, with ebony appearing roughly 3 times as often as ivory. Panther skins also appear frequently, though less commonly as live animals. Myrrh, incense, and aromatic woods were prized as well, alongside various gums, resins, and spices. Of all the precious materials brought from the south, gold held the highest importance. The Egyptians were aware of its existence in Nubia from an early period, though large-scale mining only began in the New Kingdom. Other sought-after materials included electrum, red jasper, ochre, malachite, hematite, amethyst, a variety of gemstones, and minerals used in cosmetics such as eye paint. Although Nubia was not a primary source of building materials, it did yield diorite stone and wood from the dam palm, which was used in shipbuilding. Surprisingly, given the region's arid appearance today, ancient Nubia also provided livestock, wild animals, birds, and other exotic creatures, many of which were likely brought from sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, it produced agricultural goods that were not entirely overlooked by the Egyptians. It is hardly surprising that, soon after the formation of the Egyptian state, the lands of the Sudanese south came to be seen as a vast reservoir of wealth, flowing northward like an endless bounty. To access these riches, all Egypt needed was a military expedition and a certain degree of cooperation from the local populations. That cooperation, however, often required a display of force to encourage or compel compliance. The official titles held by Egyptian officers serving beyond the First Cataract subtly reflect this pressure. Titles such as seal-bearer of the King of Lower Egypt, courtier, lector-priest, and overseer of aliens often appear alongside governor of the foreign lands for his lord in Yam, Urtjet, and Wawat, or more ominously, the one who strikes fear into the southern foreign lands, and the one who pacifies the southern foreign lands. These phrases make clear that intimidation, or at least a strategic show of power, was a routine part of Egyptian engagement in the region. When local cooperation was interpreted instead as resistance, Egypt responded with coercion, military campaigns designed to enforce submission. The justifications for such actions were often thin and cloaked in moral superiority. Accusations of trespassing, banditry, or cattle theft were frequently used as grounds for mobilizing forces. But in many cases, the records provide no more than vague claims that a certain Nubian group was planning a rebellion. A common literary theme in Egyptian propaganda describes a messenger arriving with ominous news, triggering the pharaoh's growing anger. "What is vile Iram, that they should dare to rebel during the reign of my majesty?" the king might declare. "It is my father Ammonius Re who will bring about their destruction through my majesty's own hand, so that no other foreign land will dare to defy me." Swearing by the sun god, he would proclaim, "As I live, as Re loves me, I will not let a single man of theirs survive. I will bring utter ruin upon them." The pattern of retaliation rarely changed. Two accounts, one by a vizier from the 20th century BCE and another by a viceroy from the 15th century BCE, illustrate the typical nature and results of these military actions. "I slaughtered the Nubians on several occasions in Wawat," recounts Vizier Antifoker. "Then I advanced further south, striking down the Nubian in his own homeland. I returned north after destroying their crops, cutting down the last of their trees, and setting their homes ablaze, exactly as one does to anyone who dares to defy the king." Viceroy Meramos offers a detailed account of a surprise assault on the small settlement of Ibhat. Some days after the harvest began, as the unsuspecting residents of Ibhat were tending their nearby fields, the garrison under Pharaoh's command was mobilized. Troop divisions were organized, and commanders assigned. The campaign stretched from the fort of Baki to the fort of Tarawi, covering a distance of 52 sailing units. In a single day, indeed in a single hour, the powerful arm of Nebmer struck. Cries of despair echoed among the people of Ibhat as the ruler, likened to a lion with piercing eyes, annihilated them at the command of the god Ammonius. It was Ammonius who guided him with strength and ensured his victory. The spoils brought back to his majesty from the land of accursed Ibhat were carefully tallied: 150 living Nubians, 110 warriors, 250 women, 55 servants, and 175 children, totaling 740 captives. In addition, 312 severed hands were counted, bringing the grand total of recorded losses to 1,052. These relatively low numbers of dead and captured reveal the small scale of the targeted communities, undermining the supposed threat often inflated in official rhetoric. The main goal wasn't just the capture of goods or people, it was about sending a brutal message. Entire villages were erased, their livelihoods destroyed, and survivors were often left mutilated or impaled to discourage future defiance. At the same time, such operations offered invaluable experience for Egyptian troops. Nubia served as a proving ground, an excuse to conduct military exercises using real targets. In fact, some inscriptions and reliefs were prepared before the campaigns even began, with space left blank to later insert figures for casualties and captives, if they were ever recorded at all. By the final decades of the 3rd millennium BCE, northeastern Africa and the Levant were undergoing significant upheaval on multiple fronts. In Palestine, the prosperous era marked by large urban centers, classified as Early Bronze III by archaeologists, came to an end, as these towns were either abandoned or destroyed. For several centuries afterward, settled life vanished from the region. At the same time, northeastern Africa experienced a notable drop in rainfall and a 30% reduction in the Nile's water volume. Meanwhile, along Egypt's southern border, Nubian tribes began to resist Egyptian exploitation of their land and trade networks. Unlike the 4th and 5th dynasty pharaohs, who had entrusted military and administrative duties in the south to officials from Middle and Lower Egypt, the rulers of the 6th dynasty chose instead to rely on the local elites of Elephantine for handling trade and surveillance. Whether this decision was made for economic reasons or not, it had the effect of placing responsibility for the southern frontier into the hands of those who knew the region best. These march lords were required to travel to Memphis to receive their official commissions and supplies from Pharaoh. Afterward, several routes were available for reaching Nubia. One such route was known as the Road of Elephantine, referring to the Nile path along the west bank starting from Gebel Tingar, directly south of the First Cataract. Although this path may have seemed most logical for someone based in Elephantine, it was not commonly used. Traveling the approximately 600 miles between Memphis and Elephantine involved costly harbor tolls at each stop made by the flotilla, and the difficulty of navigating the cataracts, where carrying boats and goods overland was unavoidable, made the trip even more time-consuming. While Egyptian rulers were rarely concerned about costs, they were highly sensitive to delays. Ironically, a longer but more manageable route existed through the western oases, Bahariya, Farafra, Dakhla, Karga, and Dush, eventually reconnecting with the Nile at Tomos in Nubia. Several starting points were available, but the one leading to the oasis route from Manfalut, north of Asiut, is specifically mentioned in the life story of Kharkov. This earlier version of the later route of 40 days could be traveled on foot with pack animals relatively easily. It is also likely that this was the route used to transport livestock to the royal court in Memphis. However, the leaders who journeyed south during the 6th dynasty did not encounter a peaceful Nubia. Expeditions sent to collect building stone had to be accompanied by warships, while trading caravans required protection from both Egyptian troops and local allies. Civil conflict had erupted, and Egyptian merchants were often forced into the role of mediators between warring factions. In a rare move, Pharaoh Merenra himself traveled to Elephantine to personally receive the allegiance of Nubian chieftains. Suppressing unrest in the region of Wawat demanded the deployment of large military forces, and several tribal leaders, along with their families and followers, were relocated to Memphis. Those suspected of plotting against Egypt, including native chiefs, their retainers, and even some Egyptians who could not be apprehended, were formally cursed through ritual. Archaeological findings from the era suggest that the instability described in the texts was likely triggered by the arrival of new ethnic groups in Lower Nubia. These newcomers were driven from the southwest desert as it gradually became more arid. Among these groups were the early representatives of what archaeologists now call the Sea Group people, a population that prominently included the Medjay tribe, known today as the Beja. For more than 6 centuries following the fall of the Old Kingdom, they would shape the demographics and political dynamics of Nubia. Although they left no written records, their material culture provides a vivid picture of their way of life. The Sea Group people were primarily pastoralists, depending on cattle herding for survival. Their seasonal migrations were dictated by the needs of their livestock, leading them to establish temporary settlements. The animal at the center of their economy was the bos primigenius, the horned wild ox native to northeastern Africa, which they bred in such a way that the left horn curved forward and downward, a trait still seen today. Most of their dwellings were likely wattle daub huts, though over time, structures with rounded corners and stone foundations also emerged. Their graves were typically shallow and surrounded by a low ring of unworked sandstone nearly a meter high, often accompanied by cattle skulls. The deceased were usually buried in a flexed position on the right side, head to the east and facing west, with occasional offerings of sacrificed sheep placed at their feet. Some burials also included traces of leather clothing. Artifacts found in their tombs indicate that while the Sea Group people made use of local materials, they also maintained active trade connections with both Egypt and regions farther south in Africa. A fragmented yet vivid portrayal of Nasiu and Medjay/Sea Group society emerges from the execration texts, which date from the end of the Old Kingdom through the 12th and 13th dynasties. These records show that the Egyptians were thoroughly familiar with these southern peoples. The texts mention numerous districts and clans led by foreign chieftains, whose names, lineage, and even nicknames are often recorded. Most of these names belong to the language family associated with Nubian dialects. However, a few individuals bore Egyptian names, which is especially noteworthy. Names like Tedionk and Unazonk imply a past relationship as federated allies of Egypt. Furthermore, when a chief was given an Egyptian nickname, it suggests regular and close contact with Egyptians. Occasionally, the texts highlight the wives of these chiefs, and in rare cases, they refer to female chieftains. These leaders commanded groups of strongmen, runners, allies, and henchmen, with such forces sometimes referred to as their personal armies. The primary purpose of the curse formula used in these texts was to preemptively neutralize potential threats. It expressed fears that those named might rebel, plot, or engage in warfare, and it aimed, through ritual incantation, to render them defeated or destroyed. Additional execration texts published later add interesting details to the identities of the cursed Nubians. After noting their maternal descent, the texts sometimes insert further descriptors before listing and his army. In 2 cases, the label is a noun such as calf or bull born of, leading to renderings like who is called calf or bull. In 4 other instances, the added information takes the form of a question or phrase. Examples include, to whom was said, "Are you recalcitrant?" or of whom was said, "Is there a loyal follower of his?" These additions provide insight into Egyptian perceptions of these leaders, their reputations, their stance toward Egypt, and the level of support they commanded locally. The use of interrogative forms and second-person pronouns strongly suggests that these phrases may reflect formal questioning by Egyptian authorities, perhaps part of an official interrogation process. After the death of Pepe II, the central government's power collapsed, ending its long-standing ability to demand goods and services from territories south of the First Cataract. Without Egyptian control, Nubian communities began to flourish independently, and some of their people even moved north, seeking opportunities in Middle and Upper Egypt. Although the kings of Heracleopolis managed to restore some order in the north and were formally recognized across the land, they lacked the strength, or perhaps the will, to prevent these southern incursions. Even within Egypt's borders, their authority didn't extend beyond Abydos. The 7 southernmost districts, from Hu to Elephantine, fell into disorder that not even a royal envoy could fix. The emergence of a powerful family in Thebes, led by Montuhotep the Great, also remembered as the ancestor, changed the situation. This Theban house succeeded in uniting the 7 southern districts under its rule. Soon after, the head of this family, the Lord of Thebes, took on the titles Great Baron of the Southland and Overseer of the Restricted Foreign Entry Point, Pillar of the South. As Theban power expanded up to the First Cataract, their influence also reached into Upper Egypt's 7th district. This newly unified region, which would later be known as the 11th dynasty, began asserting its own control over the 180-mile stretch of the Nile Valley and actively resisted attempts by Heracleopolis to reassert authority from the north. Elephantine remained securely under the control of the rebel king Antef II, who recognized not only the military importance of the cataract but also the economic value of its granite quarries. With granite in high demand in the north, Antef may have used it as leverage in dealing with Heracleopolis. As a gesture of respect toward the region, Antef II commissioned the construction of a shrine, the Ku Chapel, dedicated to the local hero and holy man Hiko Ib, who had lived about 2 centuries earlier. According to inscriptions from that time, Theban influence extended even further beyond Elephantine and into the western desert, with the treasurer Chetji recording that Antef II and his successor Antef III received tributes not only from Upper and Lower Egypt but also from the desert chieftains. The gradual re-establishment of direct Egyptian control over Nubia began around this period, though it would take many generations to fully achieve. Antef II proudly claimed, "Any army I sailed against, I defeated it completely in one strike. I captured its leaders and its forces." 2 generations later, following the Theban victory in the long war with Heracleopolis, Nebuchadnezzar Montuhotep I was finally able to launch campaigns both north and south of Egypt's traditional borders. Addressing his army, Montuhotep declared, "Let us march north, now that we have subdued the foreign lands. I have granted you all of their sealed treasures, everything your hearts desire." The troops responded with enthusiasm, proclaiming that the foreign leaders had come to him in submission, kissing him in reverence, and that he could now rest peacefully, with both the south and the foreign territories beneath his feet. Montuhotep recounted how he subdued the enemy and incorporated their lands into Upper Egypt. He even reached the shores of the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. He fortified Elephantine and received tribute from foreign chiefs, who came humbly, took sacred oaths, and offered their riches under the weight of forced submission. So thorough was Montuhotep's dominance that Nubia itself became a source of military recruits. A decade after his death, the victor of a brief civil war launched a new regime, the 12th dynasty, fully determined to bring the entire region between the First and Second Cataracts under Egyptian control. Amenemhet, the dynasty's founder, and his successors continually struck Nubia with repeated raids to instill fear and assert authority. One might be tempted to interpret the fortresses as grand displays of royal power, not unlike the lavish mortuary complexes of the Old Kingdom, monuments of symbolic authority, meant more to impress than to serve a practical purpose. However, written records show that the forts were intended to serve very real military functions. Their names, such as repelling the Medjay, curbing the deserts, and subduing the Bao people, clearly indicate their defensive and strategic roles. But their purpose extended well beyond simple military defense. Artifacts and inscriptions found at the sites reveal a wide range of activity. These forts were staffed not only by military personnel, generals, foreign auxiliary commanders, archers, police, and especially retainers, but also by a significant number of civilian officials, both stationed there and passing through. These included district administrators, scribes, labor overseers, engineers, officials in charge of manpower registration, prospectors, and personnel connected to gold production. Even more government representatives passed through the forts, coming from nearly every major department of the state, alongside commercial agents representing temples. Large quarrying expeditions also made use of the forts. For instance, during the reign of Amenemhet II, one such mission consisted of 20 chamberlains, 50 skilled stoneworkers, 200 cutters, over 1,000 laborers, and 1,000 donkeys, all passing by Tashka in search of stone. A state fleet regularly traveled the Nile, stopping at each fort, while a system of couriers maintained communication between the garrisons and central Egypt. Just as with the Asiatic border to the north, the southern frontier was routinely inspected by military patrols, sometimes led by generals and sometimes by civilian officials.